All right. Welcome, everyone. We're very grateful you're here for our webinar on Vice President Kamala Harris's immigration record. As you all know, less than a week ago, Vice President Harris became the presumptive presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. Immigration is and will continue to be a central issue in this presidential election. Polling consistently shows it at or near the top issue on voters' mind. And it's forming the basis of the earliest attack on Vice President Harris's record, including in the first ad blitz launched against her that was covered extensively in the press today, and we don't need to go over here. But the central premise of those ads relates to the vice president's tenure as quote unquote President Biden's border czar. Vice President Harris has a deep history of working on immigration policy, from her time as mayor of San Francisco, to her role as Attorney General of California, to her tenure in the United States Senate, to her campaign for the presidency in 2020, to, of course, the last 3.5 years as vice president, during which time her portfolio included issues directly related to immigration in our hemisphere. The one role she has never at any point held is border czar. So what is her actual record on immigration? And what can we expect from her were she to become the next president of the United States? That's what we're going to unpack today with three of the smartest experts in the field, who we are fortunate to have leading our policy work here at the American Immigration Council. This is obviously a very top of mind issue, as thousands of you registered for this webinar. And so we are going to be very tight. We're going to get you out before 3 o'clock, and we are going to try and cover this as systematically as possible. We're going to record this webinar and share it with everyone who registered. And so if you miss something, don't worry, you will get it in your inbox. So turning to our panelists, we have Adriel Orozco, our senior policy counsel, who's going to discuss Vice President Harris's previous record as a senator for California and as a presidential candidate. Then Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, our policy director, is going to talk about Vice President Harris's assignment to address the root causes of migration as vice president under the Biden administration, which is being mischaracterized as the border czar role. And finally, Dara Lind, our senior media fellow, is going to help us understand how effective Vice President Harris's root causes work was, particularly in the context of changes in migration patterns at our border, and what this is going to mean for future immigration policy. And we promise to keep some time for questions as well. And so please do put questions and submit questions as we go. So Adriel, let's start with you. Vice President Harris served for 4 years as senator of California, and then she ran a unsuccessful presidential campaign in 2020, during which she had an immigration platform. So talk to us about her immigration record as senators and the position she took in her presidential campaign, please.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jeremy. So, I think the main point I wanted to start off with is that, Senator Harris was really influenced by her opposition to Trump's policies and her prosecutor background. So Vice President Harris, she served in the U.S. Senate as senator from the state of California from 2017 to 2021. She was the second African-American woman and the first South Asian American senator to serve in that chamber. Prior to serving, she was the Attorney General for California for about 7 years. And she was then, prior to that, the District Attorney for the city of San Francisco. And so when she was elected to the Senate, she was elected at the exact same year that Donald Trump was elected to be president, 2016. So in many ways, opposing and highlighting the harms of Trump's immigration policies really defined her immigration record in the Senate. So, for example, the first bill she proposed and sponsored was in response to the Trump administration's restrictions on travel to the United States for non-citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries. This was in early 2017. The bill she proposed would create a legal right to counsel for refugees and immigrants who were arriving at the border. Some folks might remember, just a lot of folks at airports, a lot of confusion that was going on there. And she was, as senator, she actually went down to the airports as well. And she directly called Secretary Kelly, who was the DHS secretary at that time, voicing her concerns. And so she also served on 2 particular committees that have oversight of the Department of Homeland Security and the immigration system generally, which are the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and the Judiciary Committee. Through these committee assignments, I think she probably became most well known for her pointed questions of DHS leadership, For example, in 2017, she questioned the former DHS Secretary John Kelly about threatening to take away federal grants from local law enforcement agencies if they didn't comply with requests from federal immigration enforcement officers to transfer non-citizens to their custody. She approached her questioning from a legal liability lens and also a public safety lens, highlighting that law enforcement agencies were being asked to choose between civil lawsuits and complying and trying to meet their local public safety priorities. She is also probably most famous for grilling former DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen about the Trump administration's family separation policy. In fact, Vice President Harris was the first senator to call for Secretary Nielsen to resign as a result of that policy. Vice President Harris also sponsored legislation that would require DHS to establish a process to reunite separated families, to create more oversight of detention facilities, as reports of their poor interior conditions and unsafe environment were mounting. We remember a lot of those images that we saw during that time. And she also sponsored legislation to establish community-based alternatives to immigrant detention, particularly for families. In her rhetoric, she would also describe the Trump administration's policies as cruel. And she was adamant that they created a culture of fear for mixed status families in the United States. So she criticized ICE for targeting, there was also a policy where ICE targeted deportation of sponsors of unaccompanied migrant children. And so she criticized the agency for that. She questioned whether ICE itself as an agency had to be restructured as well. And so though she took very strong positions on immigration issues, she also approached some of them pragmatically. Just as I mentioned, her criticism of ICE, in 2019, there was a greater call for the abolishment of that agency, given its track record. However, Vice President Harris was always adamant that she believed ICE should exist. And she believed that that agency needed to focus more on certain types of crimes, or non-citizens who committed certain types of crimes, like rape, murder, and child molestation. So while she adamantly opposed funding for President Trump's expansion and construction of a border wall, she did vote to fund budgets that called for reinforcing surveillance at the border by expanding the use of technology to monitor the border beyond physical walls. She also tried to approach some legislation in a bipartisan manner. There was a bill that she co-sponsored with Senator Lee from Utah, the Fairness of High-Skilled Immigrants Act, which would aim to alleviate the visa backlog for employment-based green cards. And then lastly, one of her biggest positions was really being a champion for citizenship for dreamers. During the Trump administration in September 2017, the DACA program was rescinded. And Senator Harris at that time was the first Senate Democrat to refuse to vote for the end of year spending bill, unless it included congressional action to protect DACA recipients, which led to a government shutdown for a few months. Though there was no change in the program for DACA, it did show that she was committed to Dreamers and their cause. During her campaign, she actually had a lot of the same positions that the Biden administration actually moved forward on. So she was calling for executive actions like parole in place, which we heard the Biden administration just announced in June for certain individuals that would allow them to have an easier pathway to citizenship, which were stymied due to some bureaucratic issues in the immigration system. She also called for expanding the DACA program and wanting to also look at the DAPA program, which was the Obama-era program that tried to expand deferred action for parents of undocumented children. However, that was stopped by the courts. I think we see in her rhetoric that she was trying to balance the approach around fears around crime with the humanity of trying to address the immigration system as a whole. She did take a position where she wanted to close private immigrant detention centers while increasing oversight of CBP and ICE, which is something that also the Biden administration said they would do, but have since reneged. And she also wanted to take a more humane approach to the border as well, where she understood that there are folks who were forced to leave their homes and arrive at the border with no choice. And so those are some of the positions that she took. It seems like she tried to take a pragmatic approach at times, but she also really had strong convictions, I think, in terms of dreamers and really trying to also push for a pathway to citizenship.
Thank you, Adriel. That was terrific. And many of you have put questions into the chat. I encourage you all to keep doing that. We will try and answer some of those as we go on the fly, and then we'll create space at the end. But there's some great questions there about her opposition to the wall, about Afghan refugees, and there is a question now about root causes, which brings us very well to our next speaker. So, Aaron, will you tell us about her time, both what her role was? Critics have called her the border czar and blamed her for failing to secure the border. What was she actually tasked to do, and what did that look like?
Yeah, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. So I want to start by setting the stage somewhat. When President Biden took office, despite what former President Trump is saying, that the border was the most secure in history, that's not true. At the time President Biden took office in January 2021, border encounters were already high and rising. December 2020 was the highest level of border apprehensions for a December since 1999. And Title 42, the pandemic-era health policy instituted the previous year, had made it easier for many people to cross the border repeatedly. Not only that, the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Refugee Resettlement were in disarray. Roberta Jacobson, an official that joined the Biden transition team and who was the closest thing to a border czar that the administration has ever had, was initially tapped to lead border policy. And she recently told The New Yorker that when she joined the transition team, in late 2020, early 2021, she said the process for making decisions didn't exist when we came in. It was calls with Stephen Miller in which he yelled at career officials and they went off to do what he said or to try. And that's the quote directly from The New Yorker. So at the time Biden was joining, we were already seeing a large movement of people towards the border and crossing, including potentially tens of thousands of migrants who had been stuck in northern Mexico, many waiting for Trump to leave office. On February 2nd, 2021, President Biden signed an executive order directing the creation of two strategies, a root causes strategy and a collaborative management strategy. The latter was more about building up asylum capacity in the region. And so I want to focus on the former because that is the strategy that VP Harris would eventually go on to lead. President Biden's executive order says that this root causes strategy should be developed, quote, as soon as possible. And that it aims to, quote, address the underlying factors leading to migration, specifically for the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So this idea is that the administration wanted to have multiple different strategies. They wanted a border strategy, they wanted a root causes strategy, and they wanted a collaborative region-wide asylum policy to create essentially a hemispheric approach to migration, not just focusing on the border, but focusing on what happened outside the border and in the countries that people were coming from, which importantly at the time and had been for the previous 7 to 8 years, It was really about Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which is where the majority of families had come in 2014, in 2018, 2019, and indeed what the border numbers were looking like very early in Biden's time in office. But really quickly, the administration didn't have time to develop the strategy before things hit the fan. 3 days after Biden took office, the Mexican governor of Tamaulipas, which borders South Texas, declared that Border Patrol could no longer expel families with children under the age of 7 back there. And then within days, hundreds and then eventually thousands of Central American families and unaccompanied children began crossing into the border. Because the US government was so unprepared, given the Trump administration had essentially not prepared anything for this, despite seeing the signs coming, what this meant was that really quickly, unaccompanied children began backing up in Border Patrol cells. The Office of Refugee Resettlement didn't have shelters to send them to. By early March, crisis was already the narrative. The networks were sending entire teams of people down to the border. I think it was Good Morning America, or one of the major news shows hosted a morning roundtable at the border with their news desks right at the border wall near San Diego. And the administration felt that it needed to do something. So as they were working to build up capacity at the border itself, enter VP Harris to lead this root causes strategy, which had been developed initially. On March 24th, 2021, again, less than 2 months, just barely 2 months after taking office, President Biden announced at a press conference along with VP Harris that, quote, "I've asked her, the VP, today, because she's the most qualified person to do it, to lead our efforts with Mexico and the Northern Triangle and the countries that are going to need help in stemming the movement of so many folks, stemming the migration to our border." And what he talked about is his own work doing this under Obama. As Vice President, Biden himself had traveled to Central America 16 different times. He had met with leaders. He had also worked on root causes strategies. And so he said, well, I have a new vice president. Maybe it's time to assign her to these roles. But of course, what this actually looked like in practice was difficult because the strategy had not been developed yet. And at the time, people in DC and on the news weren't really talking about root causes. They were talking about children locked up at the border. And so because the assignment that VP Harris was given was ill-defined, because again, they had yet to develop the strategy, and because all DC and everybody was talking about, very quickly, a number of news stories went out suggesting that she had been named in charge of immigration or put in charge of the border response, or in some ways was responsible for resolving the issues of migration in general. But if you go back and actually look at what was said at those meetings and what everybody at the time was saying, it's very clear that that's not what her role was. In fact, VP Harris at that event said, quote, "I look forward to engaging in diplomacy with government, with private sector, with civil society, and the leaders of each in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to strengthen democracy of the rule of law and ensure shared prosperity in the region." And by and large, that is the work that she has been doing since that point. So what has that work looked like in practice? It has been a lot of economic development work, to be totally honest. In general, in May of 2021, she met with industry leaders in the United States and launched something called Partnership for Central America, which is a public-private partnership with a number of multinationals and regional banks and other organizations with the goal of increasing economic investment in Central America. Then in June of 2021, she traveled to Guatemala City. She met with women's rights advocates and she met with civil society groups and with the government. And at that point on that trip is when she also delivered the line, "Don't come to migrants." And many people as well saw that as her basically getting involved in this question of migration. And it was. But at the same time, it was really about, as one of the people who was at that meeting has later said, it was more about don't come because we're working to make things better so that you don't have to make the dangerous journey to the border, and because right now we will be turning you away, was the message the administration was trying to send. But it is a complex message of we are working on things in your home country, and also we are going to have a secure border. And the message that came out was really just the don't come and nothing else that came out. Now, in July of 2021, the administration launched its full root causes strategy, a 5-pillar strategy. Pillar 1, addressing economic inequality and insecurity. Pillar 2, combating corruption. Pillar 3 was human rights. Pillar 4, countering and preventing violence, extortion, and criminal activity. And Pillar 5, combating sexual, gender-based, and domestic violence. Most of what VP Harris has herself done, it seems, has really focused on the economic aspects of it, because in some ways, that is the easiest thing for the United States to do. Of course, we cannot simply control what happens in other governments. For example, when President Biden told VP Harris to take this effort, at the time, the president of Honduras was Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was recently convicted in the United States for narco trafficking. As soon as he left office, the DOJ indicted him, and he was extradited to the United States. He was known for having murdered his rivals, and this is the person who was president of Honduras at the time. So given that, it was quite hard for the United States to meaningfully engage on issues of things like narco trafficking when the person who is in charge of the country to engage with diplomatically is himself a narco trafficker. At the time, also in early 2021, the administration's relationships with the Bukele administration in El Salvador were a little bit frosty, and the only person who really talked to them was Giammattei in Guatemala, whose his own administration, within a year or so, have faced serious allegations of corruption and attempting to block political parties and essentially attempts to essentially block the orderly transition of power following an election. And so that sort of emphasizes that there are serious limitations to root causes work, which I know Dara is going to talk about later. So putting a pin on that for her. So what else she did? So July 21, she launches this root cause strategy. Since that point, the Partnership for the Central America has been building economic development in the region. In January of 2022, after Juan Orlando Hernandez lost his election and he was replaced with Xiomara Castro, a reformer, VP Harris went down to Honduras to meet with her. In June of 2022, she went to the Summit of the Americas, and along with Laureen Powell Jobs and the Partnership for Central America, launched a women's empowerment initiative.
I think we lost Darren. I apologize. So we'll put a pin in him and come right back to him. But Dara, let's you're back.
My apologies. I don't know how much was lost there, but just really briefly summarizing, I think, some things you said. So what has she done? It's largely been economic development. There's been some anti-corruption work. There's been some law enforcement work. She has helped support Joint Task Force Alpha, which is a DOJ and DHS task force designed to go after smugglers in the region. But in March of 2024, Harris, the White House put out a press release saying there were five that sorry, my apologies. In March of 2024, the Vice President's office put out a press release saying that their initiative, Partnership for Central America, and the work she had done had gotten $5.2 billion in economic commitments to the region, over $1.3 billion, which had already been put on the ground and invested into countries in the region. So did that do anything? Dara's going to talk more about this, but I just want to give some top line numbers. First, has there been a drop in migrants coming from those countries? Long story short, yes, absolutely. There are fewer migrants coming to the border from those three countries today than there were in 2023, than there were in 2022, than there were in 2021, and also in 2019 under Trump. In fact, if you look at just Border Patrol apprehensions, the height of Central American migrants from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador was in May 2019 under the Trump administration. There has never been a month that has hit that level of migrants from those countries crossing the border. And what we have seen over the last 3 years in particular is a sustained drop in migrants from those countries coming to the United States, even when you include people who go through ports of entry. That has not been reflected among other nationalities. For example, there are more Mexicans crossing the border today than there were 4 years ago or 5 years ago under the Trump administration. And the number of Mexican nationals rose from 2021 to 2022, even though it fell from 2021 to 2022 when you look at Central Americans. And so, in fact, and also when you look at studies that are done on intentions to migrate, there is a study that a center does every 2 years, polling people in countries around Latin America whether they intend to migrate. Intentions to migrate are, in fact, down in all 3 of those countries. However, they are down from their COVID era highs in 2021, but they are only very slightly down from 2019. So it is a somewhat mixed record because, as I'm going to turn it over to Darren now to talk about, there is a lot more going on with root causes strategies.
Thank you, Aaron. All right, Dara, let's talk about the impact then. As Aaron mentioned, Vice President Harris's work was primarily focused on the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. How effective was that diplomatic campaign? And how was that impacted by the historic levels of global displacement that we're seeing today?
Thank you. And I'm probably going to end up covering some of the same ground as Aaron, but I want to frame it in a slightly different way. I want to talk about the 2020s by talking about 2014, which is when then Vice President Joe Biden got tasked by then President Barack Obama to lead a root causes strategy focusing on Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to end and forestall a spike in migration of unaccompanied children from those countries. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's because the portfolio that Vice President Harris got given in 2021 was very similar to the portfolio that Vice President Biden had been handed in 2014. At that time, the steps that Vice President Biden took were pretty similar to the steps that Aaron has just described coming from the office of Vice President Harris. There was a lot of joint appearances with heads of state talking about how it was really important to invest in the long-term development of these countries, that was the real reason why people were leaving was for better economic security in the United States. And pairing that with short-term crackdowns on the US side that were intended to encourage people to stay in their own countries where long-term investment was happening, rather than coming to the US where they would be put in family detention and subjected to expedited asylum processes. I give you that background to explain just how hard it is to evaluate whether root causes strategies work or not, because the wave of development that the Biden vice presidency kind of encouraged and ushered in those countries was coming to full fruition in the middle of the Trump administration, when Donald Trump pulled the plug on any development to countries that he deemed insufficiently cooperative on migration issues. That make the kind of long time horizon and the fact that we're often seeing efforts made by one president or one vice president, not being really judgeable, not being ripe until the next president who can reverse those policies is one reason, but it's a really important reason why it's hard to talk about whether root causes stuff works. The other reason it's hard to talk about is because other things, as Aaron mentioned, happen in those countries that are not as easily addressable by a root causes framework in the way it's often been used. Now, I do think it's worth emphasizing that the Biden administration has talked about root causes in a way that emphasizes issues of governance, issues of equality, stuff that is hard, that is not as easy for somebody to make a big announcement about investment on. At the same time, the actual activities, the deliverables that they have really relied on this account of why people are leaving, that is very economic in character, and that, doesn't give as much play to concerns about security, about governance, about democracy, that are part of the broader framing of root causes, but often get a little bit lost on the ground. The other thing is that there are also other countries, right? Aaron talked about the drop in migration from Northern Triangle of Central America. The reason that we're not hearing much about that is because that happened at a time when migration was rising from pretty much everywhere else. What we've seen in fiscal 2023 is the past fiscal years that the first year on record when you have a majority of people apprehended at the US-Mexico border who did not come from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. And it's not just that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have been replaced by Venezuela and Haiti and Nicaragua. It's that they've been replaced by those countries, but also Ecuador, but also China and India, but also Russia and Ukraine. And so the idea of targeting a few countries and developing really long-term partnerships with them doesn't scale in an era in which what we're seeing right now is a fairly mature migration route through the Darien jungle in Panama that incorporates both a lot of people from throughout the Western Hemisphere and a lot of people flying into airports in that hemisphere from Africa and Asia, and to a certain extent, Eastern Europe. What that points to is that there's, there is something of a maximum that you can put a root causes strategy on, right? There's like there are only so many countries that you can engage in this really high touch diplomacy with. You cannot clone a vice president and say, we're going to have one vice president for every 3 countries. But that's also a really strong opportunity because it allows us to think about how is this hemisphere working beyond just, okay, what are the countries that are sending migrants to the United States? Something that I and people like me say a lot and doesn't always get through is that very few of the people who are housed in who have fled their homes in the Western Hemisphere are actually in the US, right? Most of them are in countries of what are called first asylum, or are in Venezuelans who are in Colombia, Mexican or Guatemalans who are in Mexico, Mexicans who have fled their homes often elsewhere in Mexico. There's a tremendous amount of displacement in this hemisphere as really a leading cause of the global displacement crisis. We've seen a lot more displacement in the Western Hemisphere than we saw 10 years ago. But that also means that it's not so simple as to say, well, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are sending countries, and the US is the receiving country. And so what's important is to stop them from having to send people to us. There are countries that are simultaneously host countries and sending countries, that are simultaneously host countries and transit countries. Mexico right now is a host country, a sending country, and a transit country. And so I think the opportunity for kind of the next steps of a root causes strategy, whether it's being taken by a future Vice President Harris or not, would be to turn attention back to the strategy the Biden administration put together in 2021 that didn't have a vice president appointed to head it, which is the migration management strategy, and understanding, which the Biden administration has demonstrated increasingly over its time in office, that other governments aren't just places from which migrants come, they're also partners in building asylum capacity. They're partners in making sure that people who are, who have been pushed there by disasters or by the collapse of their own countries have an ability to integrate themselves into the economy, have a certain amount of protection from deportation, and an effort to, in the long run, ensure that the US isn't seeing itself as and isn't seen as the only place you can safely go if you need to flee your home.
Sarah, that's terrific. Thank you. There are a slew of questions in the chat, and we'll try and triage by both answering some live and some by typing into the chat, and I'll try and group them as we go. So, Adrielle, why don't I start with you? There are several questions, and you touched on this a little bit, that relate to forgetting about the border for a second, about Central America for a second, looking at other types of immigration to the country. Questions about what Harris's record is on Dreamers, on Afghans, on business immigration, high-skilled immigration, and there's one which is an excellent question on, well, what would she do, or what is her record on people who have been here for 20 years when we're so much focused on people who are crossing today? But what about people who have been here for 20 years who have establish themselves in communities? What is her plan to deal with those? I'll let you direct which of those to touch on, but I think she has a little bit of record on just about all of those.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks all for those questions. I think right now, Vice President Harris has had a campaign for, I think, around 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer. And I think a lot of us are asking, what are her positions on a lot of these things? And so I think in a lot of ways, we're trying to figure out, what her positions in the past. We kind of might be able to see what her positions might be moving into the future. But I think a lot, like, Dara and Aaron, we're talking about, a lot has changed since she ran for president in 2019 as well. And I think she also has, gained different experience while in office as vice president. So I think we can look at what she's done in the past, maybe to see what she could potentially do in the future. But I have not spoken with her campaign, and I haven't seen any actual official platform around immigration around this presidential campaign. And so when we're talking about what potential approaches she might have around expanding paths either to come to the United States or to try to get folks who are here in the United States without status. She has in the past, consistently pushed for pathways to citizenship, particularly for Dreamers, for farm workers. In her platform for president in 2019 and 2020, she indicated that she wanted a path for citizenship for all 11 billion undocumented immigrants. I think there was a question that came in that touched on, the positions that candidates take during the primaries might be different from the positions they might have to take in a general election, right? And so she's kind of being thrust into a position where she's being put into a general election very quickly. And so I'm also very interested to see what kind of information will be coming out of the campaign, if there will be any specifics. We have some indications that she will she endorsed the bipartisan border bill that came out of the Senate, that was proposed in the Senate earlier this year. She has recently said that, or I think it was a campaign manager recently said that she would likely not change her position there. And so there are indicators that maybe, she might continue some of the positions of the Biden-Harris administration. But I do think that, she did sponsor a bipartisan bill that tried to eliminate some of the backlogs, the visa processing backlogs, and the visa cap backlogs for employment-based green cards, which didn't move, but honestly, not a lot is moving in Congress around immigration. Even super restrictive bills like the bipartisan border bill. So I think that's one thing that she's going to have to obviously face if she does become president of the United States, is that Congress is likely not to fundamentally change. And so she might be stymied, as President Biden has been stymied, around trying to act on expanding legal pathways as well. So I think that that's just sort of a reality to also consider, is that, there might be intentions and things that she's done in the past and positions she's taken in the past to expand these opportunities for undocumented folks in the country. But Congress is going to be, likely a huge impediment, as it has been, since we haven't really seen comprehensive immigration reform from that agency since the early 90s, the 80s.
Thank you, Adriel. So let's pick up on that for Dara and for Aaron. Then there's several questions about that impediment, about, well, she sponsored bills, but have they passed? And sort of thinking about what you would need to do to effectively manage migration flows. So we talk about there are sort of two big areas to talk about. One is the obstacles she'll face in Congress about actually turning things that have to go through Congress into law. And the second is the obstacles she'll face in managing, we talked about the 3 countries, but what about the rest of the world? What about countries where we can't send people home? What does that look like? And so would love you to talk about, even if she came in with the best plans, like what are going to be her obstacles to putting those into fruition?
I'll start. First, Congress has to act. This is the fundamental reality the Biden administration is facing, the Trump admin faced this, and the Obama admin faced this, is that we are in a world where no one has updated the legal structures for our immigration system since the 1990s. So we are going on more than 25 years of laws which were designed for a world that doesn't really exist anymore, a post-Cold War era of prosperity in Central America, where the only people seeking asylum with the presumption would be a few people who maybe arrive on planes. This was not something that when they designed the system, people ever imagined that there would be tens of thousands of people showing up at the border every month to seek asylum. And so we haven't funded or built a system to deal with that issue, and Congress is going to have to do this. And if Congress doesn't, we will find ourselves still in places where we've been before, really ping-ponging back and forth between harsh policies, crises, crackdowns, and what have you. And the other issue is that, as I think Dara talked about so much, what may be the focus of diplomatic investment today might not be the problem of the future. Countries and policies can change very quickly. We've just seen, for example, in Venezuela, the ongoing election irregularities, which threaten to send once again thousands and thousands of people out of that country. Or if there's something going on and for some way Maduro steps down, it may lead many people to go back to Venezuela. There were many reports that had the election gone the other way, many of the people who've left, 1 in 4 people have left Venezuela in the last decade, that many of them want to go back and will go back if there's a different person in charge. But the U.S., short of a full armed coup, which is something we've done in the past in Central America, but in South America, but not something that we are reportedly doing these days. There are just limitations to what the United States can do. We have sanctioned their government extensively, but at the same time, if we continue to sanction the government, they will continue to refuse to take deportations of their nationals. And so we have to view this in a broader regional framework so that other countries in the region can be supported, so that migrants don't have to come thousands of miles to the US to get some stability, and so that we have strategies that go beyond simply cracking down, because we do have to think about this in a broader lens.
The only thing I'll add to that, and this is really much more about the kind of rhetorical frame that an administration takes to the problem, because frankly, a lot of this is because of understanding expectations that have been embedded in the American public by decades of politicians telling them that soon they will be able to effect a permanent decrease in the number of people crossing, and then we can deal with everything else. From that perspective, I want to kind of look again at the don't come remarks, because the don't come remarks were kind of seen as in some way inconsistent with the root causes strategy. But as Aaron said, from the perspective of the Biden administration, they were two sides of the same coin. In exchange for lives, the kind of improvements that would maybe make their children have a better life in the United States, or have a better life in their home countries than in the United States. People were being told not to make a choice that they thought would improve their own lives now. If American politicians persist in the idea that the only way we can address some of these long-term issues is after we've achieved low enough border numbers that it's not a domestic political crisis anymore, it keeps setting up the expectation that we're going to see some kind of permanent decrease, which, as we've seen from the last decade, any crackdown has a short-term period of efficacy that doesn't last into the long run. And in the meantime, those opportunities aren't being taken to build a more resilient system so that the next crisis can be handled in a more efficient way. If an administration were to level with the American public about what we know is possible, they would say, what we need right now is to stop sacrificing the long term for the short term, but build on both of them at once. Because if we continue to say we'll get to this when the border numbers are down, we will never get to any of it.
Thank you, Dara. There are two sets of questions I want to talk about, but one I think probably is better to put a pin in for now. And that one is, there are a slew of questions about very good questions about indications of daylight between Vice President Harris and the Biden administration, or questions about the intent of, if she were to become president, how would she use executive orders the same way? Would she do this? And I think we don't want to speculate, and I think it's too early to really know. And so rather than get into the game of trying to read tea leaves. I think with our limited time, let's stick to what we do know. And so I want to pause on those questions, although I think those are excellent questions, and turn to a second set of questions in the chat, which are about taking what we've been talking about, which is very global, and making it very hyper local, which is what should she do for communities that are receiving migrants? So there's a chat about Massachusetts, and certainly this is happening all over the country for communities where migrants are coming after they arrive. So get away from the border. What happens when they get? Where are they going? And how are we supporting? How should we support those communities? And I'll open. I don't know who wants to take it, but I think any of the three of you can take this.
Adriel, you go.
Yeah, well, I can start. Yeah, I think, of course, there's the context of Congress and funding, and the need for more of that. And so I think, communities across the country that have, had a lot of newly arrived migrants, go to them, have done a tremendous job of really trying to respond without more resources. And so, the Biden administration has been able to work with the Department of Homeland Security to help people when applying for work permits, really trying to move the work permit processing to make it more efficient and be faster so that folks can get to work faster. And they've had a lot of success there. But at the same time, we still have a lot of communities in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in New York, in LA, in Colorado, a lot of places, which just don't, they've had to use a lot of local resources to be able to provide housing and other supports for folks who are just generally not allowed to sustain themselves when they first come to the United States, not able to work on their own. And so I think one thing that could be done. It's a little bit late, but there's an idea of how can the federal government help local communities coordinate resources better? How can they identify grants to be applied for if they exist? And so I think that there's sort of like a coordination administrative component to that. But really, I think, we've kind of passed through the thick of it where local communities have had to figure that on their own. And so I think really what local communities need is they need resources. They need the support from the federal government to be able to provide shelter and other supportive services to new migrants while they go through the immigration process, at least while they get a work permit, so that then they can, because as we know, there's a labor shortage in our country. There's an opportunity, I think, for coordination so that folks aren't just going to large urban centers and they can go to states that aren't seeing such high increases of new migrant arrivals, so that then they can get connected to work there. And so I think that there's there are opportunities, I think, for that type of coordination. But I do think that they're without more resources as well, I think that that's also kind of being stymied in some way.
Great, thank you, Adriel. There's another question, and I'll say, as an organization, we do all sorts of work, but in terms of our education and fact finding, we've actually had over the last year, we've done 4 fact finding trips to the border to really understand both what's going on at the border and to flows. I know Dara has been down to Central America and the Darien Gap to really understand how things are changing. Because as Darren and Aaron both mentioned, it's dramatic how quickly things have changed. And there are a couple questions on that which I think are worth digging into more. Where we might not even have the whole answer, but I think certainly with the experts on this call, we are about as close to as we can get in this country right now, which is what really is going on. So the question about our country still allowing foreign nationals to enter without visas, whose intention is to continue migrating to the U.S. And to think about, I think one of the things that was most interesting to me when we were in Nogales at the border was the second most prevalent country of origin was Mauritania. And to think of how that would logistically happen, that people from Mauritania were coming through. And I think as these understanding how people are getting here, how they're passing through and what their routes are, there's another question about what would happen if we close the Darien Gap. And so would love to pass it to Aaron and Adriel to talk about what do we know about this moment and how things have changed.
So I really appreciate the question about visa-free travel because it's something that seems like it's something that absolutely every time we see changes in migration patterns, a big factor tends to be what are the easiest airports for people to get into. Uh, the a lot of the reason that migration has shifted southward, or in terms of its point of origin in this hemisphere, is that a while back, the US successfully prevailed upon Mexico to restrict visa-free travel into its airports. And now we're seeing a lot of people from South American airports. Now, the reason why it's not as simple as those countries should just stop it is that might very well be the US's position, but the US can't dictate other countries' policies. And if you think about all of the things that we've talked about over the course of this call that are ways in, that are things that the US wants to promote as interests in the region, whether that's future economic development, whether that's democracy and security, whether that's human rights. There are a lot of asks on the table. And unless you're going to do what the Trump administration did, which is to say literally everything else that we can have in our relationship is secondary to migration, we are willing to put trade on the back burner, we're willing to put democracy on the back burner. Unless you're willing to do that, you end up making an ask of, say, Ecuador, which has been over the last few years a big source of visa-free incoming air travel. And say, okay, so your country is currently dealing with a massive security crisis. You had one assassination of a presidential of a candidate for office last year. You have ongoing issues with the long-term fallout of the Colombian Civil War. But really, the most important thing you can do is to stop people from coming into your airports without a visa. That's just not there. There are too many other equities in that relationship for that really to be the forepoint. And so you end up having to negotiate this patchwork of various policies in various places. The one exception to that is, in fact, the Darien, because for pure geographic reasons, it's the isthmus. And yes, the head of Panama has said that it's a goal of his to close that route. What he's found since arriving in office is that it's a lot easier said than done, because you can string barbed wire between two trees that intersect the path that's been established in the jungle. But people can still get around those trees. And in a region that is so impassable that even the Panamanian government only has a few patrols on the ground at any given time, it's just, I can't overstate to you how little it's like the US-Mexico border, where there's constant surveillance and essentially a 360-degree visibility if desired at many times, or along many parts. Like, the Darien isn't like that. And so the president of Panama has been forced to acknowledge that, you can, for one thing, you can stop people, but if you're stopping them in your territory, you have to have a place for them to go. And if people want to go to the United States and they don't want to be repatriated, the Panamanian government does not have the capacity to engage in mass deportation. And so what we have is this situation in which people will find ways to go to places that are safer for them, which gets back to what I was saying initially about the importance of encouraging as many places as possible that have the resources, that have an interest in their own long-term demographic success, to become homes, to encourage Panama, for example, to continue on its recent path toward accepting that people may want to stay in Panama and giving them temporary status, which was a big shift from that government last year, from working with the government of Mexico to make sure that it reverses the downward slide in security in its southern region, which 10 years ago was a big pull for Northern Triangle countries. There's so much that can be done, but it's going to require a diplomatic engagement that understands that there are other equities in play besides, are people coming from your country to our country or not, and can we stop them?
And I want to the incredibly comprehensive answer from Dara. And I just want to jump in and add one thing on top of that, which is that it's really important to understand that South and Central America have not had hard borders as we think of the US-Mexico border, for example, historically speaking. There has not been extensive border control. Free movement of peoples about the region was extremely common. And what we have seen is that is ending, and that is ending because of the United States putting intense pressure on these countries, as well as because many in those countries want to see reduced migration. There are many people who would like to have fewer people going through them. but the idea of transit countries imposing very strict barriers to stop people from doing that is quite modern as a concept, because mostly the attitude for a lot of countries in the region was, if your entire purpose is you just want to go through this to get to another country, we just don't care. That's just not our business. And so that has become many of those countries' business over the last decade, as the US has beefed up and poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the region in order to build up border security apparatuses around the area.
Thank you both. All right, I think we have time for one more topic, and a through line between so many of these questions is about her views on immigration detention. So I do want to ask about that. But since I know we've left about 50 of these questions unanswered just due to time, I want to just direct people to some resources where we can answer, and some work that our team has done that I'm tremendously proud of. So there's a statement that says, if we let them into the country with DHS documentation, they should have mandatory orientation of their next steps. They should be directed to service providers such as ours to get their orientation and processing their immigration process and legalization, starting with at least a temporary EA. So what can we do to help people when they arrive? We spent a year working on a document that is called Beyond a Border Solutions on our website about how to manage the flow. It had ideas like that. I think there's so many of them. It is a 13-prong comprehensive, if you really wanted to look at it. Certainly the world has changed a lot in the year since, but I think that's a really good primer to start. People who are thinking about their own community, on our website, there's a resource. You go to maptheimpact.org. You can see how immigrants impact your own community, your state, your city, your county, your congressional district. That's a fabulous, what industries they're working in. It's a fabulous tool for you. In our blog, Immigration Impact, where for all this, including Vice President Harris's record, we post multiple times a week of that, and it's a tremendous resource. So please do go to the American Immigration Council website. You can just Google it. But let's, very quickly in the last 2 minutes, because so many people asked about it, can we get a quick read on Vice President Harris's views on immigration detention, please?
I think I'll just give an unsatisfactory answer, is that it's still not clear. Her 2020 presidential campaign platform did include, closing down private immigrant detention centers, but President Biden also said he would do that as well at the beginning of his administration. And like we've been talking about, there's just been a lot of shifts and changes around migration patterns to the United States. So I think we'll have to wait and see if she puts out a clear platform specifically on immigration, and whether it includes anything on around immigrant detention.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Adriel, Aaron, and Dara. That was terrific. Thank you to the more than 1,000 of you who joined. Things are obviously changing wildly quickly. So please do stay engaged, stay involved. We sign up for the emails. We will get you, without spamming your inbox, up-to-date info on what's happening. And our experts are always available. There are several questions about how to contact us. If you reach out through the website, our experts are available all the time. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for engaging in this hugely important issue. Bye, y'all.